Welcome to the third panel. I think we've had a extraordinary morning, and I think you'll find that a lot of what we develop in this panel on training and developing entrepreneurs is going to speak to some of the issues that were raised in the early panels and hopefully raise some new issues as well. We have with us today four actual panelists. You've already been introduced to Devi Ninwale and his incredible story of an article written now quite over 20 years ago that has begun to animate the discussion of the environments for entrepreneurship and the development of entrepreneurship, and of course the whole notion of competition and cooperation being blended together as markets are developed. We also have with us Alessandro Golkar, who's an assistant professor at the Skolkovo Institute in Moscow, also a member of the faculty at MIT, and who works on the development of systems engineering tools and methodologies so that we can see the integration of that discipline or collection of disciplines into our work. Scott Hubbard, you've heard on the questioning side, Stanford University, but also the editor of New Space, the New Space Journal, that has sought to provide a certain coherence and understanding to this emerging field of new space that seems to have such deep roots in entrepreneurship and in the whole notion of innovation. And then Walter Peters, president of ISU, a longtime colleague of mine on the faculty of ISU, the author of a book on space marketing, and I think pretty fair to say a master intrapreneur, a person who's found ways to bring substantial innovation into what is sometimes, well, maybe even often, a change-resistant institution, which is academia. So those four will be presenting to us in just a short period of time. I'm Michael Simpson. I'm the executive director of the Secure World Foundation, and as Walter Peters' predecessor, the one that he gets the blame for all the troubles that occur from day to day. And in fact, still the privilege now of working for Walter as a member of his faculty in policy and law at International Space University. I want to open our discussion a little bit with some thoughts about key issues that we need to be taking in mind when we talk about developing entrepreneurship. And I'm using that term, developing entrepreneurship, to try to bridge all the discussion of training and education and practice and perhaps natural ability that tend to influence our thinking about where entrepreneurs come from, where their success comes from. One of the first things that seems to be utterly essential as you try to help somebody confront the environment of innovation and entrepreneurship when they're linked as bringing a new idea to the marketplace to provide a service, to create value, is understanding risk. The space sector has not been known as a risk-taking environment, but it has certainly earned a good reputation as a risk management environment. Anybody that says that space, the large space industries or the agencies have abandoned risk don't understand the amount of effort they put into managing risk. But risk is also an environment. It's an environment in which you operate, and the way you think about it can be utterly critical. I remember a student once telling me how unfair it was that little companies seem not to be able to have the success that they should have in the space sector because the big companies were seen to be less risky by many of the customers. It was a teachable moment, and so for some of you who've delved deeply into statistics, you may have heard of the concept of gambler's ruin. Gambler's ruin is a mathematical idea that says if the odds are exactly 50-50, the house always wins. Now hear that, exactly 50-50, the house always wins. And the reason why the house wins is because it has a bigger stake. There's equal variability, equal probability of wins and losses. The difference is that the house can lose a long time before it runs out of money, whereas the individual customer generally operating under the same probabilities loses their entire stake early. If you're a customer of a project that could be in the billions of dollars, you like to manage your own risk by ensuring that you're working with larger firms. And larger firms because they're less likely to go down on you in the middle of the project. Teaching somebody who wants to enter as a smaller firm that that's part of the environment and that therefore it has to be part of the risk environment they manage becomes a critical issue for them. It's one of the things that is often overlooked in trying to help somebody understand risk and entrepreneurship. Obviously, there's also technical risk, and there is, as we have mentioned several times in the morning, political risk. The risk that you simply don't understand the system, that you don't navigate it well, that you don't manage to convey your perspective well, that you, in fact, are not using the right connections or the right pathways well. So risk becomes part of the environment that you need to help somebody who is trying to become an entrepreneur, a successful entrepreneur, to understand. And one of the techniques that has been often overlooked or perhaps negligently addressed by space entrepreneurs is the issue of intermediate cash flows. We heard a couple of stories here today about companies that had very large plans. I think Nabu shared his hopes for a space debris company, but it also, that company has recognized that intermediate cash flows become essential. And so the intermediate cash flows in this case are this project of a lunar memorial, lunar messages that can generate cash while your much more expensive, much more challenging project moves forward. This is not always obvious. If you were in those 83% of businesses that we were told were not innovative or not based on innovation, you know that you're after a cash flow. That your cash flow is probably what comes from the business, that it's a business that's well known, it's in a market that's well established, and you have to find a way to generate a cash flow in that business. You don't need an intermediate cash flow when you start a restaurant. You need restaurant customers. Whereas if you're trying to put flowers in orbit around Mars, you ought to have some way of generating money before the first posy gets to the red planet. Because in fact, it's going to take you a long time before you can generate that money. So intermediate cash flows become something that you really need to help people understand that space and planet Earth are very closely related. Think carefully about doing things that can generate some money along the way. One of my favorite intermediate cash flows was Ad Astra Corporation developing the Vasmir engine when they realized that every time they tested the Vasmir, it had to be in a vacuum. And it generated enormous amounts of energy. And that created the opportunity to take medical waste and put it into the test chamber, and the medical waste disappeared in the middle of the test. Didn't make a huge amount of money, but it did help to pay the bills. And intermediate cash flows are important. The other thing entrepreneurial preparation needs to include is the notion of talent identification. There's got to be talk about working with people, with human beings, with the fact that you, the entrepreneur, may have this grand idea, this incredible notion of how to change the future of the universe, but you do not have all the skills you need to make that happen. And so you have to not only be really good, this is to some extent the competency trap, you have to not only be really good at your core business, you have to be really good at picking the right people who know the stuff that you don't know as well as you know the stuff that you do know. And that then leads to one of the real challenges of entrepreneurs, and that's what I call empowerment training. Helping them learn that not all the wisdom and intelligence in the world has been concentrated in a single brain or a single person, and that they need to develop people around them. There are numerous entrepreneurs who've managed to make that work. There are a few that almost lost brilliant businesses because they didn't manage to make it work. There are some extraordinary people out there who were fired by Steve Jobs, and they're doing quite well, thank you. But some of those were fired at a time that was not necessarily in the best interest of Apple. The last thing that I'll mention, and I think you'll hear this come up with a number of our speakers, is what I call horizon stretching. Entrepreneurs, as strange as it may be, they hate to hear this sometimes, but they have the same silo mentality that the rest of the space sector has been accused of having. They have this brilliant idea in a particular area, and sometimes they ignore the fact that there are incredible alliances available to them. There's a lot of learning in that community going on. You're starting to see some real transfer of ideas. But even there, it is poisoned by this fear you're going to lose intellectual property. And so you've got to stretch people's horizons to see the breadth of possibility of working with other smart people in other parts of the field in order to integrate. And of course, this leads a little bit to this combination of cooperation and competition that is market building, a little bit like that incredibly innovative decision of Elon Musk in his Tesla operation to make the battery technology available. I mean, the more battery technology out there, the more demand there is for electric automobiles, the more money Tesla's going to make. And it's not like they're not still innovating in batteries. So keep in mind that preparing entrepreneurs is not just about teaching them innovation. It's about teaching them to manage the engine they've created with innovation. And with that, and with a desire to give the rest of the panel a chance to give you their perspectives on this incredibly interesting topic of preparing entrepreneurs, we turn to our first speaker, Debbie.
Thank you. I actually like to stay more on this side. I just want to give you a little bit of a bias that is inside me as I kind of talk about my my sort of thoughts on building entrepreneurs or from an educational standpoint. I described to you earlier, those of you who missed the prior session, I grew up in a rural farm and then saw entrepreneurship from the standpoint of a rural community, a purely developing country kind of context. And I actually continued in that tradition between 1979, 80 to 90, about 10 years ago, 10 years time period. During that period, most of my job was more on the education from a training standpoint, not the academic education that we provide in university institutions or universities and academic institutions, but more on the applied side of the business, focus on the whole spectrum of not so much on the idea, but how you take idea from sort of an exploration all the way to starting a venture. And then that was mostly micro enterprises, the 80% or 90% of many startups in most countries. During those periods of time, I worked with GTZ, as I mentioned, and we actually had an innovative, sort of an exploratory, but ultimately it worked very well, a training program which was the entire package of entrepreneurship training. I want to talk very briefly on that, and I want to then I will get to the academic side of the entrepreneurship education. That's what I do now in the United States at Virginia Tech and some places like that. If you think of a small entrepreneur, it's basically owner, manager, the founder, CEO, whatever you call it. At least that's the early stage of a startup, right? In the process of the model that we developed in GTZ, we really focus on assessing and identifying potential entrepreneurs and assessing their ability to enterprise. This is where this session particularly relates to developing the skills, both business and technical skills, ability to start a business, and ability to run a business, and do a screening, pre-screening, so that they can be trained. Not everybody can be an entrepreneur. There are a lot of entrepreneurs, but not necessarily entrepreneurs, right? A lot of people want to be, but it's better for them not to be in sort of risking some of their savings and things like that. So there is a selection aspect early on. Identifying people, if you go back in 1961, McClellan had this need for achievement, need for power, need for affiliation, and those kinds of things. Entrepreneurs are higher need for achievement. So identifying people based on the need for achievement, need for fulfilling their passion, need for being their own boss, need to create something, the desire to excel, desire to show the world, or desire to show themselves and others. So identify the process of entrepreneurship development starts really with identifying those people who can be trained. Then comes what are the set of skills and abilities that should be targeted. And early on in the startup stage, still talking about more on the non-academic side, the program used to focus quite a bit, and rightfully so, on the what does it mean to be an entrepreneur? What does it mean to put together a lot of resources and fight with the government regulations and whatnot, and also fight with large corporations or fight with bureaucracies, both local and national? And how do you navigate? When I say fight, it's not necessarily the really bad fight. How do you navigate through that process so that you can get things done? And also, how do you understand? You brought a really good point about risk. The entrepreneurs, at least the research shows, and my experience was, are moderate risk takers. The low risk take, people with very high risk avoidance tendency, or people who are extremely high risk takers, are unlikely to be successful entrepreneurs. The high side will throw all of their savings and achieve very little. Low side will always hesitate to do anything, right? So moderate to high risk taking, but calculate risk taking is part of the assessment. Then develop the training program along those lines. So that's the education part, and that we also did. The financial support, because you may have a very strong propensity to enterprise, very strong ability to put it together, but you may not have the money. So part of the building of entrepreneur is about providing that support, which in turn can turn that passion and the expertise into a venture. So the third component we had, one is this training to be an entrepreneur. Second one is about the financial support. Third one is once they start, how do you help them? Through consulting and related things so that they can grow, they can prosper, and then they can transition to a more medium or whatever side of enterprises they are. And then right there is also this issue of risk, and also the issue of moving from a sort of a single entrepreneur manager kind of management mode to a more professional management mode. And there's a clear transition. We see that in most countries, most entrepreneurial settings. Steve Jobs cannot always be the best manager, or any good founder is not necessarily best manager. Ultimately, the entrepreneur has to let the management be taken by somebody who knows management well, and you become the developer of the business and your passion and things like that, because people skills are very critical. So I really wanted to underscore that. And so that is the informal, the training, the holistic approach, and a more of a developing country approach to entrepreneurship development. And I was actually talking earlier to a couple of Pakistani colleagues from Pakistan. So there are a few developing country models that could be useful in some of these settings. At the same time, what I do now is very different. And sometimes I wonder how do I go from the one world to the other, which is purely academic in the United States. And the way the entrepreneurship education, and I'm going to share a university perspective. Scott, for example, has a clear perspective, and you have taught and educated a lot of entrepreneurs. There's going to be a variety of perspectives. This is my kind of approach at this point in time. When I say foundational education, it's really about these early entrepreneurship thoughts, mindsets. Entrepreneurship is the right thing, an okay thing to do. Being your own boss is the right thing, as opposed to looking for government employment or corporate employments and things like that. So that's a very core level. And a lot of countries, I'm talking in a comparative way, a lot of countries don't do much of a job in building that primary education. Not primary in the grade level, but I'm talking about building the primary knowledge base and mindset on entrepreneurship. That's what I mean by foundational education. That actually helps to increase awareness about entrepreneurs, the opportunities, what it is, and why it is important to be an entrepreneur, and raises the motivation. It's okay. I've seen the role models. I've seen success. I've seen some of these growth, and people becoming millionaire with a few years of the entrepreneurial venturing. And most developed countries, Sweden is a good example, at least an example I know, where they have entrepreneurship education in the grade school, high school level. I would think Germany and some other countries certainly have that. A lot of developing countries don't have that. Business education is part of this economics, which is a separate group, and suddenly a majority of the kids are not exposed to entrepreneurship. By the time they go to college, they pick engineering, they pick some other areas, not business, not necessarily economics. Therefore, most of them don't have this business idea. So that to me is very critical, particularly if you're thinking of designing interventions in developing and even for emerging market countries. Without that, it's very difficult to push the others. Because and then once people grow up, they have their own way to, and exposure very early about entrepreneurship is fundamental. That's what I want to underscore. Exposure to risk, exposure to business ideas, exposure to what it means to manage through role models and things like that. Once that is there and they identify opportunities, the education should help, or the sort of an education and training part should help them to do a feasibility study, to do a business plan. And we have actually at Virginia Tech, we have courses that address the foundational education. That's basically a sort of an overview of entrepreneurship kind of contents. And we have a course that really gets into feasibility study, and a course that walks them through and makes them do the business plan in a thorough, systematic manner. Going and talking to customers, identifying competitors, knowing the technology, how to make the product, looking for expertise who can help you make the product or service. So that's all part of that business plan training. And a lot of countries, particularly Germany comes as a primary example to me about wonderful vocational education, from all the way from the beginning to the higher education level. Very few countries have that. That actually helps quite a bit in terms of building the propensity ability, which is very similar to the aspects earlier. But building more on the business side, along with the vocational side, I think is very critical. So in other words, the pendulum should not be too much on the technology side or business side. You've got to have a good balance, but if there is more, I would put more on the business side of it as opposed to technology side of it. Role models to me are extremely critical. More critical in developing countries, but role models are not necessarily those you cannot aspire to. Role models should be somebody you can aspire to, you can become one, as opposed to somebody very successful comes from a developed country, shows them how to become a successful entrepreneur. For a developing country role model is needed. For a developed country role model is needed. For entrepreneurship in a particular area, a role model from that area is needed, so more contextual or relevant in the context. The business and consulting, last point. Business and consulting skills is about this ongoing support, ongoing guidance, ongoing diagnostic to understand the problems, help the entrepreneur understand the problems, help the entrepreneur to figure out a way to solve and provide some potential solutions either by the government or by others, or working in collaboration with each other so that if it is a larger business or technical problem that can be solved. So consulting really helps to increase the ability and future success, because the venture becomes more and more successful with consulting support, which is like feeding the baby until it grows. Once the baby is ready to stand and run, let them go, let them be competitive and all that. But coming back to one of the things that was about role of government, to the extent that government can actually help some of these, take some of the risk, particularly in space and large-scale investment, take some of the risk away from entrepreneurs or assume some risk by putting investments and be a facilitator in the process and then get out. It is helpful in my view. And thank you very much for letting me a part of the panel, and I look forward to the discussion.
Now, Alessandro.
So just for the records, I'm not in the faculty at MIT, but I was a student there. But that's okay. I'm a visiting faculty there as of today. So what I'm going to show you now is what we do in Skoltech, is a university in Moscow, in Russia. And in particular, I will focus on our space activity. But take this just as a case. We actually have other 3 programs in other fields, like energy, IT, biomed. Space is one of them. So here it is. So you see, space entrepreneurship and innovation. Skoltech is this place here you see on the top. Actually, of that building now exists the foundation's first floor. I think we're at the 2nd floor. But it's much better than 3 years ago when there was nothing. Now we're sitting in this complex that you see down there, the Technopark, which actually exists. So we have offices as of 3 weeks ago. So it's really it's a startup institution to start. It's a startup university trying to help students make their own startups. Okay, started 3 years ago. So and actually we have our first graduates. They happened. They graduated I think 2 weeks ago with their master's degree. What do? Well, we really are focused on technology for entrepreneurship and innovation. So you see our vision there is, it says, to become internationally competitive, to accelerate scientific and technological capital innovation impact. So it's not like having, some people say, oh, this is like the MIT in Russia. It's not really like that. It's really creating a new model of university where innovation is really at the core. So you're basically creating the entrepreneur of the future. Okay. In space in particular, and as I said, this is a case study for you. So we decided to focus on the areas of space activity that are closer to the needs of the users, of the community. Okay. What do I mean by that? Let me show you. So this is kind of a simplified value chain of how space activities look like, if you wish. We have launch systems. They're used to carry satellites, right? Satellites are used to bring instruments somewhere, take some measurements, and then do something with them. So the point of this is, who has the money, who has the need is the users, right? So the closer you are to the users, then the better you are to be an entrepreneur. I mean, if you really want to be, making money, as many of you know, you don't really make money doing launchers, right? But you do make money if you do a proper use of space data, in a sense. And here is another message I wanted to give. There's two ways you can do business, let's say entrepreneurship in space. Let's call them space for space. So, a space business to solve a space problem, okay? Or space for everything else, right? So, if you're addressing societal problems, if you're addressing applications for terrestrial businesses, then all of a sudden, the market that you're addressing is much larger. Just to give a number, I think NASA budget this year is something like $18 billion something dollars, right? And it's the largest budget of a country, right? Now, if you take a company in the States like Apple, that's like 10 NASAs, okay, in terms of revenue, all right? So really, if you want to have an impact in a larger market, then you have to focus space into areas that have a much larger application of use. Think at IT, think at energy, bio, things of the like. What we have in Skoltech, we have 4 areas that we are developing in particular. So we have what we call the integrated design practice. So really trying to develop the system engineering capability for students to become their researchers and also industry partners, if you wish. We purposely focus our investments in space sensors, payloads. The philosophy is if you have a certain budget, then probably you're better off at creating, let's say, the value generating element, the sensor, and use somebody else's spacecraft or buy a spacecraft if you wish. That's an approach, right, that you can use. Then we're focusing on space data exploitation. So what do we do with the data? In particular, what do we do by intersecting different sources of data, finding new patterns, and then solving problems on Earth? And finally, robotics. And this is how, if you're a student in Skoltech, first day you come, this is what you're going to hear. You will do in your program, you will do research, you will have an education, and you will have an exposure to E&I, entrepreneurship and innovation, from day one. So from day one, you're taught, the first class you take is called the Innovation Workshop, where basically so first of all, there is a selection of the students, okay? So they already know something. And on day one, we make them apply that something to a problem that is something inspired by society, okay? And how do you use space asset to solve that problem? Well, and a typical course is an 8-week course, so it lasts 2 months, but it's on a very accelerated schedule. It's every day, and it has 6 weeks of, let's say, instructional period, so lectures, recitations, things of the like. 7th week is what we call the assessment period, exams, okay? And then probably the most interesting period, at least for this audience, is the application period. So basically the idea is, okay, given what you learned in your course, now let's develop an application, or let's start the development of an application of it, okay, based on this. So these are group projects. They can be more courses joining together to make an application period, okay? And at the end, you hope to have, to say a product, it's ambitious, but an idea of a product, okay? So something like that you could work on for later. Other things that we do to foster this type of education, industrial immersion. So every student in the summer, they have to go to some company, okay, and have an experience. What I tell to my students, at least, is go to that company and learn how to disrupt them, in a sense. Okay, so go to the big company, but then learn how to do this better. How to innovate what you see, okay, with fresh eyes, right? So this is basically what they do. It's something that is short in period, again, 4-8 weeks, but again, it's something very interesting for their education. And here you see basically what we offer. Say for industry, as you probably know, Skoltech is inside this innovation center of Skolkovo. It's a city that is very close to Moscow. And there are resident companies. For example, they actually have some of our students, and they have problems, and we try to help them solve these problems, but also with other people. And so it's a mutually beneficial. And this gives you an idea of the type of education that we offer. We have 2 tracks in space. We have system engineering, track 1. Track 2 is space data. So as I told you, first day on the job, you come to this innovation workshop, okay? At the same time, you're learning about sensors. So, how do sensors work? What do they do? How do you take measurements? Things of the like, okay? And then there is, as you will see, there is a pattern here. So, later on, they come actually to me, and, we do this course in spacecraft design, right? But on the side, you still keep working on this course. We have ideas to impact. Again, is to try people to make them understand how to make a business plan. Okay, so again, imagine your audience is the 20, 21-year-old person with already a bachelor degree or a master degree, and you want them to expose them to entrepreneurship and innovation, okay, in space in this case. Then there is a very interesting course called the Sector course that we have. Basically, we invite CEOs and CTOs from companies and to tell them, please explain your sector to the student. Okay, so you have the space telecommunication sector, CEO of some company comes and talks. Remote sensing, CEO of some remote sensing company comes and talk. Okay, so it's really, as you see, it's intertwining technical studies and this type of exposure. Okay, and then at the end of this whole process, remember each of these boxes there is an application period, and one of the things we're trying to do is to have something that goes along. So you start the project in course 1 on the sensor side, then you develop the platform, then you develop the mission, then you develop the business case around. So hopefully by the end of the degree, you've simulated a lot of projects, okay? And what they can be resulting in thesis, they can be resulting in startups. Actually, I'm going to anticipate something I want to say later. 65% of our students are involved in startups as of today. Actually, we already, I think some of them already found investors that bought them. My students, by the way. Actually, I think the investor is in the room here right now. So, okay. Let me see what else. Yeah, so this is, as I said, 65% of our students at the end of this process have some startup or startup idea they're working on. And there is a lot of flexibility in Skoltech. So, if you're a space student, nobody prevents you to take an IT course, to take an energy course, to take more, let's say, information on IP, licensing. We have courses on that too. So it's really, you can craft your course with certain guidelines, of course, but at the end of the day, you get kind of a unique experience that you can bring with you. Just to give you an idea now, the space faculty is still reduced set. By the way, we are trying to hire. So if you bring back this information to your organization about space data, we're trying to hire faculty in the space data side. Right now we're 5 in the Space Center. But it's not just these 5 people. There is 50 faculty in total, and we really work synergistically. We don't have departments in Skoltech. That's because we want to, feed this culture of multidisciplinarity to solve complex problems. Okay, this not only goes to the students, but also goes to the faculty. With this, I want to thank you. Here are some links here if you want to see more about us, and please do ask any questions.
Thank you, Alessandro. And now crossing either the Pacific or the Atlantic to get to Stanford, Scott.
Thank you. Thanks to the organizers, Ken Davidian, all of you for being here and for inviting me to come and be with you today. Although this is the session on entrepreneurship, education, and training, the title of my talk, as you see, is The Characteristics of Innovation and Entrepreneurship. What can Silicon Valley teach aerospace? The genesis of this talk was a study that I conducted over a period of 2 years. And I came into doing this study with a very varied background. Some people might say I had a variety of experience, others might say I can't keep a job. The fact is that I have a 40-plus year career in R&D, 6 years at a national lab, Lawrence Berkeley, about 5 years with a startup venture in the San Francisco Bay Area, 20 years with NASA, which ended up with me being the director of NASA Ames, which is right in the heart of Silicon Valley, and then the last 7 years at Stanford. So I was approached by a client, a consulting client. Stanford, like many research universities, encourages strongly its faculty to spend a day a week and at Stanford to be engaged with the industry in the Valley. They really want the faculty to know what's going on, to be at the leading edge of whatever is happening in their specific technical area and to contribute to that and bring what they learn back to the students in the classroom. So I was approached by an aerospace client, said, well, you've been all over the map here. You've been in national lab and private industry with NASA. Now you're in Stanford and you've been in Silicon Valley most of those 40 plus years. So is there anything there that is a secret sauce that we can use to inform our work in aerospace? So this was saying, take a look at innovation and entrepreneurship in Silicon Valley writ large. I mean, the chip industry, the internet platform industry, all of that, and see if there are certain common themes that could apply to aerospace. And having had a background in all these pieces, I thought, well, let's take a look and see what we can find. So for the purpose of this session today, in the next 10 minutes or so, what I've done is to extract a very narrow slice out of what is about an hour and a half lecture that is, I hope, directly related to education and training. Anybody who's interested in the longer presentation, you can see me after the session. So one of the organizations that I benchmarked was Hewlett-Packard Labs, HP Labs. And they said this is what they use as their mantra for innovation. It's a quote from Peter Drucker. Why do we need, in this meeting, yet another definition of innovation? It's because the last word. They say innovation, they chose to define it for their purposes as the instrument of entrepreneurship, an act that endows resources with a new capacity to create wealth. As you heard from the previous panel, a lot of us got into the space business because we had a dream. You know, when I was 9 years old, I wanted to know if there was life elsewhere in the universe. And that has driven most of my career. Even today, I have one foot in the entrepreneurship side, the other foot in solar system exploration, particularly Mars, because I've always wanted to know, are we alone? And to me, this is one of the big questions for humanity. But when you get to entrepreneurship and innovation in Silicon Valley, it is about creating wealth. It wasn't, I think it's in my bio somewhere, full disclosure, I serve as the chairman of the SpaceX Commercial Crew Safety Advisory Panel. So Elon Musk has a group of us come in a couple times a year, open the box, and say, well, this is good, this sucks, this will kill people, and then give that advice to him. And I can tell you, without violating my non-disclosure agreement, that although Elon has a vision, he is in the business to make money. He's not operating a charity. And so this word, create wealth, really defines a lot of the difference between entrepreneurial companies that must meet a payroll. I mean, when I did a startup venture, I had to pay payroll out of my own credit card 1 week because you're in the business to satisfy shareholders, stockholders, and take care of your employees. So let me tell you a little bit about the broader study. What I looked at was how do you train, and for that I'll go into some detail to the Institute for Design at Stanford. And then I looked at 5 companies that, although they're fairly large, I didn't look at startups because I wanted companies that had an established reputation as being innovative. Google, obviously, IBM Almaden, Intel Labs, Cisco, which builds space routers, for those of you who weren't aware that the Cisco is responsible for a lot of the messages zipping around between satellites, and HP Labs. And I'll just focus, to keep this short, on the Stanford Institute, Google, and Intel. And then I'll give you the common themes, the things that I believe might be applicable across the broader sphere. So, Stanford Institute for Design. It was founded by a grant by Hasso Plattner, who the Europeans, the audience, will know was the father of SAP, which is one of the largest enterprise software platforms in the world. And he put the money in to Stanford, said, I want an Institute of Design. He was able to get David Kelly, who's the founder of a very, very innovative company called IDEO. Many people, if they want to get something that's really original, they'll go to David Kelly. And they put together this institute. And the institute, as I'll say in a minute, really has turned out to be about design thinking. It's a particular practice. And what they do in this master's course is they bring in people from almost any kind of background and immerse them into projects and training, and they end up getting a master's from Stanford in design. It's part of the larger so-called D school, the design school at Stanford. And this is the characteristics. It is a way of looking at a problem. It is not only a series of courses that you take, and their informal but very powerful statement, credo, is that invent something, get a widget, turn it into a product, and form a company. And that's what you end up with at the end of this course. And they really focus on the idea of the T-shaped person. People come into this course as lawyers, physicists, electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, people with a relatively narrow but very deep background typically. And what this master's course does is to give you that broad top of the T. How do you do financial analysis? How do you do business management? How do you raise money? How do you monetize something? How do you turn it into a product? How do you sell that product? So this T-shaped person is the very essence of what they do. They also have executive education courses, but their summary philosophy is to be very end-user centric. And in these exercises that they do, it's really fascinating. They will say to a group, okay, let's imagine that you're creating a product for an emerging country. Think about what the needs are, come back end of the day or tomorrow, tell us what product you created. And they will inevitably find that people that were trained in, say, deep engineering practice will come in and say, okay, we got this great idea for a brand new software platform, and what you do is you do this Java code and you convert it to C++, and then we're going to put it on an iPhone, and the instructor said, wait a minute, I told you to create something for an emerging country where they don't even have power, much less an iPhone. You've got to go back and rethink this. Who are you designing this for? What is the end user? They do team teaching. They have to have rapid prototyping. You go into their space, which is maybe the size of this floor, and movable platforms, lots of devices and tools and materials stacked up, and they move the platforms and the shades around so people can be in different groups of different sizes. Very open, very few closed offices, and it's all learning by doing. There are academic level courses or academic style courses where they will lecture, but a great deal of ending up with your degree out of this is by doing these sample projects and learning by doing. Design thinking. This is, I think, if you were to ask David Kelly or one of the instructors, what's the essence of what you do? They would say, we should have named this the Institute of Design Thinking, because they say, they believe very strongly, that having worked with hundreds of organizations in products and services and environments, they believe true innovation happens when you've got strong multidisciplinary groups coming together, building a collaborative culture, and then exploring the intersection. The way my bumper sticker is innovation at the intersections, where physics meets biology, where engineering meets chemistry, where marketing meets fundraising and so forth. This is where these things bump against each other and you get new ideas. So that's the Institute for Design, a very innovative but academic way of training people into innovation and entrepreneurship. Now let me quickly give you two other training and education benchmarks, but from industry point of view. And this has to do with my discussions with some of my former employees. As the director of NASA Ames, we were forever training people, getting them to be really useful to the space program, and then as soon as they had a family and wanted to buy a house, they'd go to Google or IBM or HP or some other place. So I called them graduates. All right, so they were graduates of NASA Ames. I would go visit my graduates and say, how's it going? What have you learned? And this particular individual was the head of my intelligent systems division, and you can imagine why Google would want to hire him. And he said, what we've got there is a real tension between creativity and execution. They've got people that are blue sky, big picture thinkers, and they've got people that know how to turn that into a product. And this tension has to be managed, but it's extremely valuable. They invest in people and teams. They identify their rising stars. This is part of keeping their culture going. All the engineers got roughly 20% of their time to go and follow their ideas. And a lot of new products came out of that. Gmail came out of that, for example. And they pair the innovators and the implementers, the middle managers. Once Google got big enough to not be completely flat anymore, they had to introduce a layer, middle management. The job of those people is to manage that tension between the innovator and the implementer and be an amplifier, not an obstructionist. And then what someone alluded to earlier, stopping the investment is just important as when you start the investment. What's your exit strategy? Have you met a milestone? Is this going to be useful? If not, let's move on to the next thing. Don't continue it forever. All right? The one other example I wanted to give was Intel. One of my now longtime friends, Paul Otellini, who's retired a few years ago as the CEO of Intel, addressed head-on the problem that most innovative companies bump up against. You've got the innovators in the labs with the new ideas. You've got the implementers and executors. And in between, you've got what some call the valley of death, where you're going from the bright idea, but it doesn't make it into a product. So Paul addressed this head on. He had a big internal effort and said, how do we bridge this gap? There's this huge cultural divide. The product people don't have any time for the laboratories. Don't bother with that. I've got to ship. I got to ship product. The people in labs, they want to publish. They want to create something new. Don't bother me with the shipping milestone. I've got to finish this great idea. And so as you can see graphically, publish, do research, publish, move on, repeat, cycle. Over here, requirements, schedule, get your team, milestones, schedule, budget, product, repeat that, and then you've got this gap. They created something they call pathfinding, where they would actually identify a senior fellow. They use some of the same language that the old Bell Labs used to use, a senior fellow whose job it was to bring together the R, the D, and the P people, research, development, production people, and to be a shepherd. Be the shepherd to get these bright ideas into a product, and also to encourage a certain number of researchers to move from their R&D lab over to see what it means to actually have to ship product. Doing this has been for them very successful. The hit rate on products is up. Moving the concept from R&D to a product was part of their corporate bonus structure. So they put a significant financial incentive into making this work. And then, in terms of training, the R&D people have become rock stars. You know, they're not just the nerds in the labs. The people with the ideas are now acknowledged by the company as having an equal type of value to those who are out there selling the product. So Paul says, Ottolini said, this was important for them. So now just to wrap up, out of this whole 2-year effort, there were certain common themes. Be collaborative. As has been said numerous times, the best ideas often come from somewhere else. Your partner, maybe even your competitor in the co-opetition sense. It's multidisciplinary. In order to be effective at entrepreneurship and innovation for the space sector or many other sectors, you've got to combine business acumen with good physics and engineering. That's particularly true in space. You ignore the rocket equation at your peril, and you've got to know how to create a product that will sell. You need to be open. The companies that have been most successful, at least in this study, were the ones who are willing to share their IP. It's like the example of Elon Musk giving away his battery technology to expand the field so that you have a bigger pie. You've got to put the money in. All these companies put in 4 to 10% of their income into R&D. Typically, though, the D was much, much larger than the R. I mean, the basic research was still a narrow slice. They were looking for disruptive technologies. They had an intentional process, and I found this is often a big difference between the successful companies that would go to product and the unsuccessful ones, is you can't just leave it to chance to get these things across the divide. They had to have, it varied, but have an intentional process. There's one example I didn't have time to show you, which is that one of these companies would do, they call it an innovation jam. I think it was mentioned yesterday about having a jazz jam session. They do an innovation jam. Literally 1,000 ideas would be then identified and winnowed down through an intentional process to 15 that they would put serious funding behind. And finally, I do think, which is the theme of this session, that entrepreneurship and innovation is teachable, as exhibited by the Stanford D School, and then I teach some courses related to this over at the UC Berkeley Haas School of Business. One final comment about culture in Silicon Valley. It's okay to fail. This is not necessarily culturally transportable, but in the Valley, the successful entrepreneurs often are on their third company. So they've tried and failed twice, and the third time they've learned enough and made enough contacts to make it successful. But as part of the secret sauce is, if you're going to go and be an entrepreneur, you've got to be willing to fail and get up and keep after it, and you will eventually succeed. Thank you very much.
Great job. You're on, Walter.
So, good afternoon, and thank you so much, Mike, also for the introduction. When I was asked a few days ago if I could present a few slides, I made a mistake. I did not expect so many people in the room to be familiar with ISU. I now, after I talked to a few people, think something like 2/3 of the room knows ISU. So I'm going to say something very boring about ISU, but still I think it's important for, if I may call it like that, the boundary conditions of what I'm going to tell afterwards. Now, first lesson is I looked what the other ones are doing, and I hope I managed to use this tool. So ISU, I just give it here in a few pictures. The headquarters are in Strasbourg. You see this building. You also, if you look very well, which is maybe very difficult from your position, see that there are a number of things on the building, like a tracking station, radio telescope. This is not because we are focusing on research. but we want to have these, what Scott called the T-shaped people, also to be involved a little bit in what is radio astronomy, what is a tracking station, what is a ground station. We have mainly two programs. One is a formal master, and you see here the graduation class. The other one is a session which we do during the summer period. And the summer period is different in the northern and in the southern hemisphere. So we coupled the two sessions. So we have one session in the northern hemisphere called SSP, and one session in the southern hemisphere called SHSSP, because that's winter here. So to be sure that both of them could benefit. If you look at the participants there, if you look at the pictures, you will see, besides what Scott said correctly about the T-shaped group, probably one dimension which is stronger in our case is the international dimension. What we try to have is a very international group, because we really believe, this is a real belief, that these people will have to work together. And I'm talking about India, I'm talking about Pakistan, I'm talking about Brazil, talking about China. This is not the case yet, but later, in 20, 30 years, our European American students will work together with the Chinese students on a day-to-day basis. So we can better teach them now to work together and have a different thinking. Which, by the way, is also very interesting for innovation, because there was a French philosopher, for those who speak French, who once said, "Du choc des idées jaillit la lumière." That means, it was Voltaire, that means that if you have a number of different ideas, the end product is sometimes better if the ideas come from different angles. And I've seen this happening with Indian students, Chinese students, together with American students. That ends up at the moment that, at this moment, we have something like 3,900 alumni, 4,000 in a few weeks, because there is one session with more than 100 students in Ohio. Relatively well distributed over the world. Unfortunately, still some gaps in Africa due to funding problems. All our courses, I'm not going to go again through them, you can read it, all our courses are based upon a number of principles. That means we bring a number of students together, or participants rather, which have, most of them already, a high profile, in particular in the SSP. To give you an example, 15% of the present students in Ohio have a PhD already, so we're not talking about bachelor's degree. We try to mix international, so what we do is to make sure that there are different nationalities. And we try to do a lot of, as you also said, teamwork, as also our French Alessandro and stressed. It's a very by the way, there are very similar approaches with yours. Maybe thanks to also Mr. Crowley, who knows ISU very well. That could be the key. Why are we changing our philosophy? I think we pretend, and I think we manage to be ahead of the evolution of the space sector. And one of the elements that we have is a strong board of trustees where NASA, ESA, DLR, CNES, also industry are involved, because they are interested in having our graduates prepared for the future. So it is a little bit guessing what the future is going to be. I'm using this picture to show a little bit of an evolution. If you look at the space sector and you compare it in a 10 years period, if you compare 2003 to 2013, the first thing that you see is, it's maybe not so dramatic, but there is a clear trend, if you would plot it, that a number of sectors are going slowly down in percentage. And one sector is going quite up, which is the services sector. So the area where the money is in the downstream area. The second thing is, of course, if you teach and if you prepare students to get, the first objective is to get a job. That all the alumni know it. Now, you have to see who recruits. And of course, the people who are at the moment not able, I know that NASA would love to recruit, but ESA, the same thing, but they cannot recruit at the moment because due to the funding problems. So the people who recruit, exactly as you said, are the startups or the young companies. So we have to prepare our alumni to be able to work in that environment. And that's why we're cultivating more and more entrepreneurship in ISU. I also use, tomorrow probably she may use it also, somebody who worked for SP is now working for ESA. You see immediately where the money is. If you look at this diagram and you look at your three axes, I mean, main access, telecommunications, navigation, and remote sensing. The biggest part of the money is the downstream. There is the money, and that's where the money is to be earned. So we are trying to prepare our students for this area. They have little chance to be recruited in satellite manufacturing, little chance, unfortunately, to be recruited on rocket factoring. It's a limited area. Companies are going together, are merging. The agencies are not recruiting that much, so where do they find a job? Here. That's where they will find jobs in the next few years. Just for the little bit to make it a little bit lighter, I am not going to put a name, but at a certain moment, Gail, the NASA astronauts made this chart, and they came to the conclusion that if the budget of NASA is going to continue like that, there are two possibilities. It will be either zero in 2030, or the federal budget will be infinite. Now you can choose between the two. Probably the reality will be between the two. But it shows again that for our alumni, the big classical organizations are not going to be their main domain where they will find a job. Now, there was a famous scientist, Niels Bohr, who once said that forecasting is very easy, unless you try to do it for the future. I'm going to try it anyway, because we have to be ready to tell our alumni, our students, what's going to be the future and what is the environment, the boundary conditions they're going to work in. So let me give a few, which can be highly criticized, I know, but somebody has to put them up. Let me give a few feelings that we pass on to our alumni. The first thing is that you see a reduced funding in the public sector. You saw it over the number of years. The best you can see is a stagnation. Stagnation means also no creation of new jobs. So I think that agencies more and more will focus on R&D, new technologies, new developments on the new aspects, and that's all they should, in my opinion, which means that the downstream applications will more and more move to the private sector, as I've shown already. At the moment it's a bit difficult, and tomorrow I know there's a number of venture capitalists. If you make the curve of equity financing at the moment is pretty low. I think when the crisis, normally equity financing goes up 2-3 years before the crisis is down. There's always a factor. So I think it's going to go up in a few years. So that is something they have to know. What is a business angel? What's a venture capitalist? What is private equity? What is an equity firm? They have to know that, and they have to know how to work with them. And that's the basis of what we try to tell. Of course, you see the space commercialization, which is certainly more favorable now, also due to the Obama strategy of giving more commercial and even areas, let's be very honest, which 20 years ago we never thought about. Who thought 20 years ago about commercial space transportation? Now we can genuinely talk about and say that our students will be involved in these sort of things. If you take the Sierra Nevada Corporation, Lockheed Martin, Orion, think about it. One block which may take some time but certainly will have to be relaxed is ITAR. This is still also for the American industry a very big problem. It's also a problem for us to place students on internships in America, by the way, as a side remark. And then there are two things which I believe that the future generation, I see a number of them here in the room, will have to think about is first of all cleaning space debris. It's a very big problem, which is becoming, if you see, for instance, an SAS, which is the Luxembourg, one of the biggest companies, or an Intelsat, how many maneuvers they already have to do with their satellites to avoid space debris, and every maneuver costs a lot of fuel. So this is a real big problem which is going to have to be solved. Probably the second problem that may have to be solved is propulsion. And I see with pleasure also that a lot of the startup companies are using very inventive ways of greener propulsion. So these are trends that we think our students will have to take into account. So what we thought, we had all these courses on entrepreneurship and innovation. A few years ago we started something new. And what we do now at the end, just to give you one example, what we do at the end of the master course is a 2 weeks specialized elective on entrepreneurship, but very hands-on. So the first week, I am inviting a number of people out of the practice, people who are working on business intelligence, like people from the Tauri group, or people from Foodtron in the past. I'm talking about a number of venture capitalists. I saw in the program that somebody from Triangle will be here tomorrow, I believe. So a number of our students, ex-students, alumni, are now working in venture capitalists. So they get some lectures mixed with a business plan preparation. I will explain that to you. So from the beginning, we ask them to make a business plan. And the second week they can work on it. And at the end, for a panel, they are to offer their business plan in a sort of competition. We make 4 groups. We make sure that every group is very T-shaped, as Scott said, that there is a lawyer in the group, or that there is an economist in the group, that there is a Chinese in every group, that there is an Indian in every group. Luckily, we have them. So that is very international. Now, we put a lot of thought, and maybe this is just as an idea, we put a lot of thought in the boundary conditions to give them. And this is going a little bit indirectly back to a question of Mr. Forster this morning. What we're telling them is, I want to see a business plan on a space application with a 25% internal rate of return over 5 years, and with a very 1-digit, 2-digit growth at least every year. And that is forcing them to look into existing markets. Because it is just too long, and I think that's also what Alessandro said, it's just too long to have such an IRR. You don't make it if you start with something where you have to go the whole TRL scale. So you have to start with something existing. Otherwise you don't make it. Your IRR, you don't make it. And you see it also with the proposals that they make, that they realize very quickly that reinventing something completely spectacular, you need 7 years before you have a TRL 5 or 6. So they don't make this unless they take an application which is immediately bringing money. Then we do like I saw it a few times in Silicon Valley also, I was sometimes in a panel, we give them maximum 10 minutes, a maximum 10 slides, that's the boundary condition, and something which is maybe a little bit unusual, we're asking them to make a 1-page business plan. This is the example I give them. I show it the same way there because I know students. If I show it too obvious, they will copy it. That's the nature of the beast. So I'm also showing it like that to the students. Can you give me a business plan on 1 page? Now, it's more challenging to put a business plan on 1 page than on 20 pages. And it forces them to be synthetic. It also forces them something else, to get consensus. If you have 7 or 8 students in a group with different nationalities, different cultures, it's an enormous, difficult project because you are peers. It means there is no boss. You have to agree between themselves. I had a few Chinese students, I know there are a few Chinese people here, who said the biggest thing I got away from ISU is that I could not say it's like that, as I do during my job, but I had to convince other people. And this is something that I didn't know how to do that before. Before I was appointed as the boss, and that was it. So if you look now at the examples, and again, Mr. Forster, thanks for your remark this morning, you will see that most of the things that come out are very down-to-earth applications. One group is now already, one of the first groups who came up with an idea is now going very fast. Maybe some of you have heard about it. It's Spire. It's a project from our alumni. What they found out, very simple, is that most of the ship owners don't know where their ships are. Very, very surprising. I also didn't realize that, but they don't know where their ships are once they are out of the coastal radars and so on. So they have now a project which works fantastically. They started, of course, in Silicon Valley, and have now groups in Singapore. There's also people from Singapore here, and in Glasgow, where they make their small satellites. Last year, one group which we found having a thing, what we do in fact with venture capitalists in the panel is say this idea has a chance or not. Last year we said 2 have a chance and they're trying it. One is a very simple application of ground stations for small sats. because you cannot build a complete ground network if you just have as a university, so they wanted to lease small sets. And the other one is a very simple GIS applications for, it's a bit like what you call in operations research a traveling salesman problem. How do I go from one place to another, taking into account the weather conditions, traffic jams and so on? How do my truck goes from one place to another, which they want to try to sell to transport companies. This year we have one group who, in my opinion, has a good chance. They are looking into a software to lease unused transponder capacity. So they are working on a software whereby you can say, hey, I need a transponder next year from May to September. Who has this transponder available and can I get it for a reasonable price? So, bottom line, we have to think about employment of our alumni, and that's why we are turning a little bit into forcing them to think about these downstream applications and preparing them with this type of programs in not only how to theoretically make a business plan, but also make a practical one. One small add-on to that, I'm sorry, this marketing is my background, so I cannot stop it, but we'd certainly be more creative for the students if there would be also a prize in seed money on it. If the winning team, for instance, could have a little bit of seed money to continue its project, if it's 50,000 or 100,000, that would, of course, increase the energy that they put in it. So, Mr. Chairman, that was what I wanted to share with you, what we are doing now with ISU after your presidency. This is a little bit of a change. And good to meet you.
One of the pieces of wisdom in academe that university presidencies are relay races and not marathons, and so I'm glad that you took the baton. We're going to innovate a little bit. That seems appropriate under the circumstances, and we're going to move right directly to questions from the audience, so you don't end up ending up with 3 minutes of questions after we've reviewed what we've just said. So, questions in the audience? Yes.
So there's nobody else. I volunteer to put a question forward. I admired very much the wealth of experience you have generated in Moscow, in the States, in Strasbourg. And I asked myself, if we want to broaden the interest for entrepreneurship, is there a more general movement to actually teach entrepreneurship at regular universities, or what is the way? For instance, if we start now in Bavaria a larger program, it will not be possible to send the students to Silicon Valley. It's too expensive. That would spend all our money already. But maybe it would be helpful if the universities are taking up that possibilities in the future. Is there any movement to broaden the teaching of entrepreneurship in universities?
Walter, and then we'll move down the line. I think we've got some life here.
Thank you. I cannot say that there is a movement, and I also have to stress one point, because I'm working with one university. If you have a specialized university, I think it's difficult for the faculty to do entrepreneurship. One way out could be to export the model like our friends in Moscow, or that we are doing in Strasbourg, and for instance having a team going to a specialized university and taking a 1 or 2 weeks workshop on it. I guess that would be more efficient than trying to have the classical faculty, which are specialists, with a few outsiders, making an entrepreneurship course. So my suggestion would be to think about the model whereby a classical university invites a group of specialists from, and I want to be neutral, who are doing this, if it's from America or from Russia or from Strasbourg, to come for a workshop for 1 or 2 weeks. This workshop is very portable, can be brought over to another university. If the university itself can develop it, maybe not.
So let me build on Walter's comment with two examples that I have from Stanford and from UC Berkeley, specifically the Haas School of Business. In terms of short courses, being able to get an intensive immersion in the principles and practices of Silicon Valley is fairly well established at those two institutions. I know I have participated in executive education courses that are tailored, typically a few weeks long to maybe a month, where groups, the groups I work with are in what we call high consequence business. That could be the launch industry, oil and gas exploration, nuclear power, national laboratories. And I'll teach a couple of modules based on the Columbia accident and revising the Mars program. Others will talk about other things, and these are typically a few weeks long. The other example is longer, but also involves this idea of students and rising stars. Remember, I mentioned several of these Valley companies really make an effort to identify the rising stars. And I'll give you one example from a country that is somewhere between emerging and developing. They asked all of their universities and all of their industries to identify their rising stars, and they ended up with what they called the top 500 in this country. They put out a request for proposals and selected Stanford's Center for Professional Development and the Berkeley Haas School of Business to create 2-month immersive courses, and they sent these people over in cohorts of 40 or 50 at a time and had this very intensive experience that was tailored just for them, that included visits to Silicon Valley, hands-on work, lectures, and so forth. I was part of that. And the feedback and the questionnaires seemed to indicate that this, for them, was a good way of exporting this knowledge, because many of these people were assistant professors, tenure track professors who came there specifically to try to learn some of the secret sauce with the idea they would go back to their home university and establish a course based on that.
So I will add to what Walter was saying. One of the reasons why I think there is this type of courses, this type of programs, is because the world is changing, if you wish. So I think we all grew up with this idea that comes from the 60s, 70s, where there is the big government agency managing funding, and then there are these big companies in which you're going to work in large teams, and so all the education programs are designed around that, right? Today there is a new reality, right? So as the panel was saying before, the traditional jobs are decreasing. So you have to do something else. You have to be an entrepreneur. And let me tell you from the Russia side, Russia is very strong in mathematics, in physics, in specialist knowledge, right? So if you want to do a new university, it doesn't make any sense to compete with that great body of knowledge. So you have to work on the other side of the T. So you have to work on things like how you're going to make your knowledge to use. Okay, and this is not. It's actually a huge intellectual step for students. The least I observe in the environment. People who come from Russian universities, they're very, very strong in anything that they do, but the jump from theory to practice is not obvious. Okay, so basically, what's our role is to be catalyst. Okay, so just to be a catalyst and let them understand how can you put your knowledge to use, and the other main message is there is not just the equation that you have to put in place or just the design, but also the business case, understand your sector, understand what you're doing. These are really important things. And actually I agree a lot with this idea that these things can be taught and can also be exported. Actually we started doing this in Russia. So we're part of this thing called the CDIO, Conceive, Design, Implement, Operate. It's actually an organization. And one of the things we do, there is this academy where people from Russian universities come to us and we show them some cases. So basically, we try to export these things out. So, and there are lots of challenges, but it's also a very fascinating thing to see how people, after an experience like that, they're able to bring to their own home universities a new way of teaching, a new way of educating. And last point I want to make is it doesn't just go to teaching, but also on how you choose, hire faculty, and how you incentivize them. So in the tenure track system, actually what you would see in Skoltech at least, there is a third, so you're not just evaluated for research, you're not just evaluated for how you teach or service, but there is another thing you have to write in your tenure package, which is about innovation. So what do you do about innovation? So you actually have to, if you want to succeed in that environment, you have to have this type of inclination.
Thank you. I'll just make a couple of very quick points. Yes, entrepreneurship is becoming very popular. In most American business schools, large business schools, there will be entrepreneurship programs, whether it's a major in entrepreneurship or a minor in entrepreneurship, and often a combination. You can either do major or minor, or sometimes could be possible both. The business school certainly is one of the key players in entrepreneurship. If you look at business, the universities, large universities, engineering and business schools are two places where you see a lot of entrepreneurship happening. And I belong to a large organization, association called Academy of Management, which is my professional association. It has a lot of divisions. One of the fastest growing division is actually entrepreneurship division. Virginia Tech, my school, for example, which has about 30,000 students and university, and the business school has about 4,000. Business school has 3 areas of focus, and one of them is entrepreneurship. The other one is international business, and third one is big data or analytics. So you can see from that in terms of entrepreneurship. The second point out, that is a great program, and I would love to actually push some of the emerging economy professors or developing country professors to go and get immersed in a program like that you described, Scott. Because part of the thing I think we got to do is extend the idea of entrepreneurship beyond the developed world. And the emerging countries have a lot to learn, developing countries have a lot to learn, and there are systematic efforts in that regard, and which is great. It was an amazing example to hear.
Yeah, I think one thing that I would add, one of the hats that I wear is chairman of the board of a small foundation known as 10 to the 9th Plus Foundation. It basically is trying to help 1 billion people in 10 years. But using innovative, rapidly accelerating technologies. And we've just entered into an agreement with the Silicon Valley Community Foundation and Singularity University that is housed on the Ames Research Center to have a not-for-profit innovation incubator for people who've come up with ways to use these technologies like nanotech and biotech and genetics to help as many people as they possibly can, but in a not-for-profit environment. Singularity's already been doing that in a for-profit environment. So I think there's a tremendous amount of interest and a lot of models out there that can be duplicated probably on a fairly simple exchange of intellectual property without having to ship people around the world. Other questions? Yes?
Hi. I'm a professor at a business school in Brazil, and sometimes our students, they complain that at the business school they are mostly trained to work for someone else's company. They're not really trained to develop their own company. But on the other hand, okay, we have like some management disciplines at the technical schools like engineering and IT, for example. But at some point, okay, the students, they have the technical skills, but then they are not really aware on how to start up their own company. So it's just a question for discussing. What do you think would be more efficient to increase management disciplines in technical schools, or to approach students from business schools with students from engineering and other technical areas?
Great question.
Actually, I'll press, but I want to hear from you because you really have a blend of engineering and business, but that's where my answer goes to. You're right, I fully agree. I mean, I teach entrepreneurship, and the first day of class, I say, how many of you want to be entrepreneurs within the next 2 to 3 years? Only a couple of hands go up. Raise to 5 more go up, and then 10 years, then some more go up. But most of them, the business schools have not done a good job, and I blame myself in that regard, is not really motivating people to be an entrepreneur. The motivational side is still weak. And with training for corporate world, the other side of it is, I think entrepreneurship is one of the areas where interdisciplinary education makes a lot of sense. Having engineering students and business students come together and have that T-shaped management kind of approach to entrepreneurship education is the right way to go. One more point I would add, for example, schools like Virginia Tech, I bet Stanford and the others are very similar. We have a lot of intellectual property generated by engineering and science faculty. A lot of that goes unutilized. Business students are in a better position to actually say, okay, here is an idea, here is a technology, here is a collection of technologies. Let's see if we can create something out of it and commercialize it. And engineering students have the background and expertise in technology. Business students have the business side of the knowledge, and then that's how I think the entrepreneurship education should be.
Okay, so I will just add a note on our experience. In Skolkovo, right, say 1 kilometer from us, there is a management school. They do an MBA program. So you may ask, why? So why do you need 2 schools doing, similar things? Actually, we do very different things. So when students come to us, we say very clearly, this is not an MBA program. Okay? If you want an MBA, there are many other schools to do that. The difference is that we think entrepreneurship and innovation can be taught to engineers to do their job. So, the engineer that should educate this way is an inventor, right? So it's somebody who has the idea and also has the skills to execute them. And actually, as Scott was saying before, innovation typically comes from the intersection, right? So when you cross things together. So, at the end, MBA is not the only answer. That's what I want to say. It's one answer. And actually, presumably, you will end up partnering with some people with an MBA background, right? But it's also good to have, this type of hybrid education to make you better talk to these people, because otherwise you speak 2 different languages.
I suppose that there's at least 2 answers to your question, probably many more. One is you cannot neglect the influence of the local ecosystem or the local culture. The Bay Area, Silicon Valley has a lot of unique aspects, probably, in my view, going back to the gold rush of 1849. I mean, it attracted people who were really willing to roll the dice and come out and take a fly at being millionaires in the gold mining business 150 years ago. More recently, what you have, of course, are several world-class universities, along with the development of a number of companies. Lockheed was established there in '47. The story of the invention of some of the engineering capabilities at Stanford is that as the World War II was developing, and then the Cold War, the people from Lockheed and a couple of the other companies, before it was Silicon Valley, while it was still orchards out there, but a few of these big companies came to Frederick Terman, who was one of the early leaders of Stanford, and said, look, we don't have enough people that have this training that we need in the aeronautics and emerging aerospace, and as well as materials and some of these other capabilities. Why don't you create something for us? And that was the beginning of this cross-pollination between the industry that's there and the university. And that continued. It's no accident that there's a Hewlett building and a Packard building and a Gates building and so forth, because of this constant interchange. So I would say that one element is an interchange between the academic sector and the industry sector. So they understand each other's culture, each other's problems. They begin to develop an interest. As I mentioned in my talk, at least I think I did, the Stanford faculty are encouraged, in fact, almost required to know what's going on in their field in industry, in addition to publishing and for tenure and so forth. The other answer is that because of this, there have been created things like the Institute for Design, the Department of Management Science and Engineering, that goes to Debbie's point, where this intersection is formally recognized and coursework is given, degrees are given in this intersection. And so it can be created, it can be fostered. The one thing that I will mention, if you want to do this in your area, is something that I learned by serving on the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, where we went into not only the technical cause of that tragedy, but the organizational cause. And what I learned is that once culture is established, it remains unless through leadership from the top over a long period of time, you make it change. Culture is an amazing thing. You can draw all the organization charts you want, you can change the brass plaque on the door with different names, and unless you keep pushing on it, that culture won't shift. Somebody will leave and it'll spring right back to the way it used to be. So if you're trying to get a national culture or a local culture that fosters innovation across industry and academic lines, it does take leadership. And it takes leadership over not a few days. You can't just make a speech. It takes leadership over years.
Thank you, Scott. One thing I think we have to be very careful, and your remark alarmed me a little bit. We need good engineers in the space sector. We need good physicists. We need good financial people. Not everybody has to be an entrepreneur. So it is a bit the American expression, we should not force them. You can bring the horse to the water, but you cannot force it to drink. If he doesn't want to be an entrepreneur, I think we should respect it and let him do a PhD, become a physicist, and so on. The second thing which I have seen, but this is again my limited experience, is that this mixing of different disciplines between the students is often the good catalyst, to say it now a little bit chemical. Because students, even if we don't like it as professors, we have to be realistic, students believe more the other students than the professors. So if there is we have medical doctors talking about osteoporosis, but then the students will say, yes, I'm going to ask that tonight to the other student who is a medical doctor. That's the reality. So I think with bringing this mix together is probably better than trying to force it into a thing where you maybe have to, well, if we don't know anything in economy, we use the Pareto rule, 20-80. So maybe 20% of your students want to be entrepreneurs, 20% of the engineering students want to be entrepreneurs. I still believe it's better to bring these together than to try to enforce something on the other 80%.
Well, thank you very much for being an attentive audience to a fascinating subject, and please join me in thanking the panel. And so now, as your reward, coffee in the hallway.